Hello everybody, this is the Daydreamer with Daydreams and Nightmares, and it is time for another contest video. This one is going to be for Hazeldan1216. They are currently celebrating a milestone of 100 subscribers, although the last time I checked, they were currently sitting over 200 subscribers, so they're doing really well. Anyway, they are asking you to basically tell them about your comic book experience, and whether or not there is a grail or a book that really defines or changes the way that you do collecting. And normally when I do oh, by the way, I'll say this first. For their giveaway, I'm going to put a link down in the description down below so you can go check it out. Okay, let's get back to story time. Normally when I do a video for comic books, I usually do it off camera because I believe that if we're talking about comic books, that the comic book should be the center of attention. That's what you're looking at. You're checking out the covers, you're trying to find out about stories. So instead of me being in front of the camera, I usually try to promote the books. In this case, the story is about me. So there aren't going to be any comic books. What I'm going to do instead is, like I said, tell a story. They want to know about my comic book experience, and I have actually done several videos in the past where people have asked, you know, what was it? What's the book that you first got? Where talk about your what you collected and why and things like that. And I've done that, and I've actually shown off books and done it that way as well. I thought I'd try a different approach and just tell a story. For me, I have always loved reading from a child on. For me, foremost, when I pick up a comic book, for the most part, although I've started with a lot of influence from a lot of other collectors, I have started collecting some comic books for the art and the covers. But I have always, my entire life, been a reader. And foremost, when I pick up a book, the first question that I ask myself is this something that I want to read? I'm a person that wants to read a comic book because it is a book, because there is a story, there is a storyline, there is a story arc that interests me. And like I said, as a child, I would go to the library and read as many books as I could get my hands on. And I read just about everything in our public library, and I graduated to going out into the adult section because there weren't any books left for me to really read in the children's library. But one of the things that got me into collecting comic books was a transition from reading stories about my favorite characters in the movies and on TV. We had the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man and Wonder Woman TV shows in the 70s that I watched, and cartoons with the Super Friends and X-Men and Spider-Man as well, that got me into reading those comic books. First comic book I ever picked up, and I show it, and I have it, and it's in a mid-grade, because when I was 7, 8 years old, I wasn't worried about saving a comic book for its condition, and it's been well read. But it was a Star Wars comic book. It was the very first one I ever got, and I still have it, and I've held on to it throughout the years for that reason, is that it has that nostalgic value of that was the first one I ever got. throughout the years following, I would pick up comic books based on what I found interesting in TV and movies. With it, like I said, with the characters that I just mentioned, Spider-Man, Hulk, with the Uncanny X-Men, X-Factor, New Mutants, were a lot of the ones that I was collecting back in the 70s and 80s when I was a teen. One of the things I really enjoyed, I don't remember the first time I ever went into a comic book shop to uh, buy or collect comic books until, say, the late 80s, when I actually started collecting them on a regular basis, which I'll get to in a moment. For the most part, they were newsstand ones that I would get at in the 70s and early 80s. They were newsstand ones that I would get by going to the grocery store. One of my rewards, for running an errand, one of my errands was to go to the grocery store and go grocery shopping. And for doing that, my mom let me pick up a comic book. And that's where I first, started collecting ones that were the ones that I had just mentioned, picking those up off newsstand because I'd go to the grocery store and Mom would reward me by letting me buy a comic book. And I've held on to a lot of those over the years as well. For the most part, I grew up relatively poor. I didn't have an opportunity to buy any books that were high end. To be quite honest, even to this point, I don't have any big boy books in my collection. And when I did really get into collecting the comic books, going from the occasional one I picked up at the grocery store to actually going to a comic book shop, I started picking up books from DC Vertigo. The storyline of Sandman, Animal Man, Swamp Thing, Hellblazer were more adult-oriented, story-based comic books that got me more interested in collecting comic books because of the stories. During the 80s and 90s, the stories were very superhero oriented, and this new line of comics created by writer Neil Gaiman, and bringing in other writers that created these very elaborate storylines and lore and worlds, interested me, and all of a sudden I was wanting to read every one of them, and those were what started me in collecting comic books on a regular basis and getting all of these. And then also you had the expansion of having different comic books coming out from Valiant and Malibu and other publishers during the late 80s, early 90s. As a teen, I was still either living at home, or when I went to college, I was at college with all the student loans and financial aid and all that. All my living needs were taken care of, so I had a little extra money to spend on comic books. So a lot of the books that I currently have from that period that are now currently worth money, I actually bought off the shelf. So those, like right now, pretty hot books are the Deadpool book, the first appearance, and Cable's first appearance from the New Mutants. I actually bought off the shelf, and some of those Amazing Spider-Man from that period I bought off the shelf. Problem is, about mid-90s, I graduated from college, going out into the real world. I suddenly had student loans to pay back, rent to pay, all of the utility bills to pay. I suddenly no longer had the extra cash to spend on comic books. And in order to pay back some of those bills, I actually sold off quite a few of my comic books that actually had some value, like ASM 300. And there are others that I had from like the Sandman and the Hellblazer and other series that I had that I sold off, about half of my collection, to help pay bills that now I'm regretting not having held on to, because of their current value. But anyway, so what happened is I stopped collecting mid '90s, and I had I don't know, 8 long boxes worth of comic books that I've held on and have moved with me over the years. And a few years ago, I started watching YouTube channels with collectors in comic books, and watching their channels and seeing what was out there now, and it kind of sparked my interest into starting to collect again. But with that, from mid '90s to mid 2010s, about a 20-year gap in there of comic books that I didn't collect. And the entire landscape of collecting comic books had changed. So it wound up changing the way that I'm collecting now, because there weren't a lot of variant comic books. There weren't a lot of focus and emphasis on artists and covers back in the 80s and 90s when I was collecting. And also a lot of the titles that I really enjoyed from Vertigo had moved on, or had different versions of them, or their storylines within all of the characters that I followed. One of my favorite characters is Wolverine, and to see him go through that entire shift and change in becoming Old Man Logan, and having the story of Laura Kinney, and even well, with a legacy. Every one of these characters has had a change in the story. There's new characters, Iron Man and Ironheart, and Laura Kinney and Logan. Just there's all of these new characters playing the characters that I really liked as well. So the landscape on the stories had all changed as well. And I've gone through and I've started collecting new books and getting myself in and finding books during that period where I wasn't collecting, and catching up on those. But when it comes to grails or big boy books or anything like that, the only ones, I don't have much in my collection in the way of having things that are valued over more than maybe a few $100s for a comic book, and I haven't spent more than $100 on a comic book. So most of what I have that I've been collecting are probably what would be considered minor keys, or low and mid keys and things like that. I don't really have big boy books because I still have big boy bills. I'm paying a mortgage and still paying off the student loan, and I can't afford to play in the big boy game. So I don't have any really big grails. Although when I look at it, the books that I want to collect are the ones that I am missing from the period when I was collecting. So for me, a grail would be to be able to replace that Sandman run, and that Hellblazer run, and the Preacher run, and the books, the ASM 300, and the other books that I'm missing from that period when I was collecting. And I have gotten a few of those back. For me, those are grails. I would love to have a first appearance of Spider-Man, or first appearance of Hulk, or first appearance of Wolverine, or any of those in my collection as well. But right now they're beyond my ability to pay for. But anyway, I'm enjoying getting back into collecting and finding these books that interest me, that I want to read. But like, as I said, the way I look at things now have changed, because the landscape has changed, and the way that comic books are made, and the way that comic book stories have changed from when I was collecting back in the 80s and 90s, and now. And I find myself collecting more books for covers and for artists than I had previously, and looking for stories that interest me. And I find more stories in the independents that are more interesting to me as well now than I did back then. I'm going to cut myself off because I know this is going to get too long otherwise. But anyway, that is my story and it's still ever changing, and I'm still collecting and still finding things that interest me. But anyway, if you've actually stuck around this long, I'm going to mention again, go check out Hazeldan1216. Congratulate them on already gaining over 200, even though this is a 100 subscriber giveaway. And once again, that link will be in the description down below. And thank you for watching.